The containment of China, the choking of China, is common ground for all of them. They simply disagree on how to do it best, whether to do it through the war in Ukraine or, as Trump suggests, end the war in Ukraine and concentrate on China. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for this opportunity to have an intimate, closed-door discussion so that we can speak freely. So I'm going to cut to the chase because my topic, I think, is the most pressing issue for humanity at the moment. The new Cold War that the United States unleashed against China. This is not a shared responsibility. It is a decision by Washington, D.C. to unleash a Cold War against China. It started with Donald Trump. It was already in the making from the Obama administration, but it has been reinforced exponentially under Joe Biden. And the reason why I'm saying that this is the most pressing issue for humanity is because we are being quick-marched towards the precipice of a nuclear confrontation that the United States authorities knowingly are making a real possibility. And the question is why? The first question. And once we go through the analysis, then of course the second question, and of equal importance, is so what do we do about it? I enjoy very much placing American and British in particular journalists who are part of this propaganda machine, you know, Financial Times, Guardian, Washington Post, placing them in a difficult position with a very simple question. Why? Why is the United States declaring essentially a new Cold War against China? And the first word that comes out of their mouth is Taiwan. And I said to them, what about Taiwan? They said, well, the Chinese want to take it over. Well, I said they always wanted to take it over. What's new? I mean, it was always the position of Beijing that Taiwan is a province of China. And at some point, they will have to fall under the fold, like Hong Kong did. Didn't Richard Nixon know that in 1971 when he was visiting Beijing, making friends with China? Didn't Clinton know that when he was inducting China into the World Trade Organization? Why wasn't Taiwan a problem then? What has changed now? They look at me, well, China is spying on us. The NSA is spying on you. The CIA, I have, and that is the truth, and the line knows this, we have a 3-point NSA tap on me, my phone. That is, 3 points means that if I talk to you, you're spied on. If you talk to your wife is spied on. If your wife talks to your child, your child. So I know that, they've told me that. So I don't believe the Chinese are as good as the NSA at spying. I mean, the NSA was listening in to Chancellor Angela Merkel. This was revealed. And then, you know, when Angela Merkel was told that, immediately she said, okay, do you want me to speak louder so you can hear me better? So it wasn't a problem, right? Now suddenly, that China is developing surveillance, and I hope China is developing surveillance methods, because, you know, if you're being spied on, you need to spy back on them. It's the only way. One of my great friends, and I'm very proud of that may shock some of you, is Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. And Julian Assange, a very brave man, said to me once that, what do you do with Big Brother? How do you stop Big Brother? Well, what you do is you develop the technology so that you spy on him while he's spying on you. So counter-surveillance is the only way of dealing with surveillance, so that they know that you know that they know. This is essential for maintaining any degree of autonomy. So I hope China is developing its capacity to counter the surveillance of the NSA. And it's a joke. I mean, the people in the NSA are laughing their heads off when they hear journalists from the Wall Street Journal saying that the reason for the new Cold War is that China is spying on the Americans. And then I hear other idiotic answers like, you know, the Chinese are building naval vessels they are projecting naval power. Well, I will believe this. I mean, of course, you're building naval vessels. You're expanding your economy, you're expanding your capacity to project your own power. That is essential. That's what every country must do if it respects its own interests. But I'm going to be worried about Chinese imperialism when I see Chinese vessels outside San Diego and Los Angeles and Chinese army bases next to El Paso on the US-Mexican border. Until we see that, it is ludicrous. You just look at the map of the Pacific and you see American bases everywhere creating choke points for China. And this is their official policy for 40 years. And they have the audacity to say that China is a threat because China is... Anyway, enough time wasted on these non-explanations of the new Cold War. Now, you may have heard of, I won't mention him yet. The more sophisticated analysts in the United States would invoke the so-called Thucydides trap or Thucydides curse, that, to put it in very vulgar terms, if you live in an anarchic world, if you are a child, a boy, and you go to school, a very rough school, and there are lots of bullies, you should be the biggest and nastiest bully. That is the cynical, realist school of thought of American geopolitics, that America, in this anarchic world, because they don't really believe in God, they don't believe there is a God that will help them, they think that they must be the nastiest, biggest bully in the world in order to defend themselves. Their survival as a nation and their prosperity will depend on their capacity to bully everybody else and from preventing anyone who is getting too big for their boots to become an equally sized bully. And they will say to you that they were bullies around the world, like, for instance, Imperial Japan, Imperial Germany, the Soviet Union, and what the United States have succeeded in doing is effectively eliminating them, annihilating them, getting them out of the way. And that now China is rising, China is next. And therefore that explains the new Cold War. Now there is no doubt that the deep state in the United States, and make no mistake, the United States is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy with elections that are providing the legitimacy for this one-party state to continue to exist. And when I say a one-party state, I mean one-party state. Take, for instance, Victoria Nuland. You may be familiar with this diplomat of the Washington establishment. Victoria Nuland worked for Bill Clinton. She worked for George W. Bush. She worked under Clinton. She worked under Trump. And no doubt she was going to work again for whoever wins in November. Victoria Nuland is an example of the single state, deep state of the United States. Now, that deep state, single party establishment in the United States is split along the line of two different conflicting views, neither of which is good news for China. There is the more intelligent, nuanced line of thinking, that which in academia is represented by that very intelligent man from the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer. The view is this: they are very critical of the inability of Washington to focus on what is necessary, and their overreach. They think that the United States is overreaching. So they are very critical of the war, of the United States' role in, firstly, through Victoria Nuland, creating the circumstances through the coup d'etat against Viktor Yanukovych, the then president of Ukraine in 2014. They created a coup d'etat in order ethnically to cleanse Russian speakers from the eastern side of Ukraine in order to provoke Putin into the first stage of war in 2014 against Ukraine, so as to push for NATO expansion in Scandinavia and, of course, Georgia and Ukraine. And so this pragmatic viewpoint simply says that we shouldn't be doing this, because that way we are pushing Russia into the arms of China. And the whole point of the Nixon administration was to split the Soviet Union from China and therefore win the Cold War. So they are critical of the support of Ukraine and of Israel, because they think that this simply disorients the United States policy. It creates alliances amongst Americans' enemies, like alliances between Russia and China, Iran and Russia, and so on. And that this is silly politics because the enemy is China. And China needs to be contained. And if you ask them, why does China need to be contained? China doesn't have a history of imperialism. China has absolutely no interest in building military bases on the US-Mexican border, in taking, naval power and projecting it to San Diego or Los Angeles or San Francisco. China doesn't want that. China wants to trade. You know what they say? Yes, we agree. But if we let China become a regional superpower in the Pacific area, in its own area, in its backyard, if we allow China, for instance, to become dominant in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean, then China in the future will start trying to do what we have done. And they will become an imperialistic force in the Western Hemisphere, which for them is the Americas. This is what they say. They understand that China is not imperialistic, but they fear that if they do not contain China through choke points, just north of Indonesia, the first array of islands, the second array of islands between China and the Philippines and so on, then China will emulate the United States, and therefore you better prevent that by choking China today. So that's one line of argument. The second line of argument is the opposite argument, that the United States must be a bully everywhere, all over the world, including in Europe, including the Ukraine, and that, for instance, I have been told that by somebody who was very high up in the Bush administration and who was very high up in the chain of command of NATO in Brussels, an American Republican. He said to me that we need to expand NATO against the interests of the Europeans. He was clear, against the interests of the Europeans. And I said to him, Bob, why? He said, because of three reasons. First, because we must be in Europe, the United States, to keep ourselves in. Number one reason he gave me. Number two, to keep the Germans down. Look at the price of electricity in Germany today as a result of the war in Ukraine. The German industrial machine is finished, kaput, as a result, not just of that, but that is one of the reasons. And thirdly, to keep the Russians out. So this is, if you were in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., this is the discussion you would hear. The containment of China, the choking of China, is common ground for all of them. They simply disagree on how to do it best, whether to do it through the war in Ukraine or, as Trump suggests, end the war in Ukraine and concentrate on China. Well, this, so far, what I have presented to you is more or less common knowledge amongst anyone who's ever been in Washington, been in Brussels, spoken to these people, to the Cold Warriors, to the new Cold Warriors. This is common knowledge. But I think that story that I've given you so far is incomplete. Why did the Clinton administration and the Bush administration after that were so gung-ho about trading with China? Why did they not start the new Cold War against China in the 1990s, in the year 2000, in 2004, 2005, 2008. Why was it only around 2014 that this establishment decided to unleash the war against China? It's not that one explanation is that the Clinton administration people could not see that China would develop to the extent that China developed, that it would become so big. I don't believe that. I never believe explanations which presume the stupidity of the people involved. I don't believe that these people were stupid. And I don't believe that they didn't see that by shifting half of American manufacturing to the west coast of China, to the east coast of China, that China would not grow and develop. They knew it. They were celebrating it. I remember, for years hearing that, capitalism is fantastic because look at China. The moment it introduced the market economy, and they become a superpower. So they knew it and they wanted it. Why don't they want it now? Why is it suddenly choking points and containment and, putting a boot on their neck? What really changed? For me, the essence of the pursuit of a new Cold War against China by the United States, by the way, Europe is irrelevant. Europe is simply doing as it's told. Europe doesn't want to unleash a Cold War against China, but, they get the email from Washington, D.C., do it, and they do it. Against their interests and against their wishes. So don't care about the Europeans. It's Washington. If you were somebody like, a strategic thinker like Henry Kissinger, who is now dead, but this is the example of the deep thinking American official. What would you really be worried about? Since I mentioned Kissinger, let me stick to him for a moment. The year was 1970. Kissinger, at the time, who was working for President Nixon, you'll recall, was not the foreign minister, was not in the State Department yet. He was the head of the National Security Council, and he was the National Security Advisor to the American president. And he was the epitome, all his life, of American strategic thinking, the thinking of that one-party state, the deep state of the United States. Being a smart man, when he saw the macroeconomic statistics, and he saw that from 1968 onwards, America, for the first time since the 1930s, had become a deficit country. For the first time in its history, since it became a superpower or an important power in the mid-war period, and certainly since the 1950s, when it was the only superpower in terms of economic superpower, the United States slipped from being a surplus country, from having a surplus in its trade balance, to having a deficit. And Kissinger was worried, because he knew that, historically speaking, every empire that went from being a surplus to a deficit economic entity started fading. So he got together his people at the National Security Council, and he asked them a simple question. What should we do in order to retain our hegemony, now that we are a deficit country? And he said to the people, go away and think about it, and I want from each one of you half a page of a note. Very interesting, right? Not 20 pages, half a page. Not a page, half a page. This is how Kissinger worked. And these were very smart people, right? Most of them came back and gave a very Germanic answer. If we have a deficit, we must cut down our expenditure, we must increase interest rates and so on and so forth in order to reduce imports and bring about a balance between exports and imports to eliminate our trade deficit. One man, in his half a page, which I actually acquired in the process of writing a book 15 years ago, typewritten half a page, he said, what we must do, we must treble our deficit. We have a deficit which is bad. We must make it 3 times as big. and make the capitalists of the rest of the world pay for it. Which is exactly what happened. The United States should increase its deficit and use it to create aggregate demand for the net exports of Germany and Japan. And later on, China. Because it is the trade deficit of the United States that sucks into the United States your aluminum, your electric vehicles, deficit dollars, like IOUs. And, when people ask Paul Volcker, but will that not affect the value of the dollar? He said, no, not as long as it is the only world reserve currency. The only currency that has demand, people demand it, even if they don't want to buy anything from the country which is producing it, which is printing it. So, if you are today somebody of a mind comparable to Kissinger's, then you know that the reason why the United States is so hegemonic, why it can afford to be the big bully around the world, is because of the monopoly of the payment system. And let me give you an example, which I gave when with Wei Wei were having this conversation at China today. China now. Now today, close. When Trump was elected, because he hated Obama so deeply, he wanted to take down something that Obama was very proud of. Obama was very proud of two things, Obamacare and the agreement between the West and Iran over the nuclear program of Iran and the ending of the sanctions, which was signed by Iran, by the United States, and by the whole of the European Union, enthusiastically. And Trump wanted to destroy that agreement just because he hated Obama. So he takes the agreement with Iran and tears it up. The Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was very annoyed because she had worked very hard together with Obama to bring about that agreement with Iran. And German businesses were already in negotiations in Iran to enter Iran. Iran is a land of opportunity after so many years of sanctions for large conglomerates like the German ones, especially when it came to energy, to consumer products, to car manufacturing. They were all ready to get in. And Trump says, no. Merkel comes out and gives a press conference against the President of the United States. This is unprecedented. That doesn't happen often. And she says, I do not know what the United States will do. We respect their opinion and their position, but Germany is going to maintain the agreement, the peace agreement with Iran. And German businesses will continue to do business in Iran on the basis of this international agreement, which we are going to fulfill and which we are going to honor. Within 12 hours, every single CEO of every German conglomerate came out and said, not us, we're not in, we're out. We will follow the Americans. Why? It's really very simple, because they depended on their net exports to the United States. And the Trump administration threatened them that they would not benefit from the tax cuts, the reductions in the corporate tax that Trump was bringing in. He said to them, you want to benefit from them? No business in Iran. You want to maintain your access to the dollar payment system? No business with Iran. So the German conglomerate leaders turned against the German chancellor the day after she gave a press conference, effectively saying, sorry, Chancellor, we are going with President Trump on this. Against their own financial interests in Iran and in Europe, which is exactly what they're doing now. The United States, together with Ukraine, bomb the pipeline, Nord Stream 1, that costs billions every week for German industry. Have you heard a German industry say anything? Nothing. Because they are dependent on the American trade deficit. But this whole thing, for the trade deficit of the United States to function as a vacuum cleaner that sucks into the United States the net exports of Germany, of France, of Japan, and of China, you need the dollar to remain the monopoly, the monopolistic transaction system, because it is only the monopoly of transactions that allows the Americans to continue with unfinanced, unfunded deficits. Then you look at the rise of what I call cloud capital in the United States and China. By cloud capital, I'm talking about what lives in here. The algorithmic capital on which big tech is built, which is a new form of capital because unlike other forms of capital, which are always a means of production, a produced means of production, a robot, a tractor is something you produce to produce something else. This is not a produced means of production. It's a produced means, an artificial means of behavioral modification. That's what Alibaba is. That's what TikTok is. That is what Tencent is. That is what, of course, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and so on. They are capital goods that create non-markets, platforms that look like markets but are not markets, which allow the owner of that cloud capital to bring us in as buyers, as sellers, as influencers, as opinion makers, as simply consumers of entertainment, and charge all of us a form of rent. That's enormous power that the ownership of this cloud capital confers to the owners of cloud capital. Now, there are two countries in the world that have a lot of concentrated cloud capital. One is the United States, and the other is China. And the reason why you have it here is because you banned Silicon Valley. Europe didn't ban Silicon Valley, so we all depend on Google, Facebook, Meta, all that. And we didn't develop our own cloud capital. So there is American cloud capital and there's Chinese cloud capital. Chinese cloud capital has an advantage over American cloud capital. This is something you've got to understand. Not so much because, your technology is not better than the Americans. In some things, you have gone beyond American capabilities, but in other things, the Americans are bigger and better and faster than you are at this stage. No, it's not a technological advantage that you have. It is a political advantage and an organizational advantage. Here in China, the People's Bank, the Central Bank of China, controls the bankers. In the United States, the bankers control the central bank. They own the central bank. They created the central bank. The Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, was created by J.P. Morgan. It was not the other way around, okay? It's important to understand the institutional differences between our countries and the United States. The United States is a very, very strange place. So, cloud capital, Silicon Valley, in the United States, and finance don't work together. Apple Pay exists, Google Pay exists, so like WeChat, you can pay through Apple Pay, but a large segment of that money goes to Wall Street as a rent. So there is a class, something like a class war between, or a feudal war between the fiefdom of Wall Street on the East Coast and the fiefdom of cloud capital on the West Coast. They're clashing. That clash doesn't happen in China. Because both your finance sector and your big tech or cloud capital sector are under the Communist Party. I'm being very honest and frank with you. And that's a good thing. That is an advantage. But if you're sitting in Washington, especially after the war in Ukraine, especially after your central bank created the digital yuan. The digital yuan is a fantastic invention. You should treasure it and you should use it and you should develop it, and we have discussions about how to do this. Your country has built a digital superhighway for money, which is much, much more advanced than the rickety road that is the American dollar road. Because today, that superhighway is not used. It's like, imagine, you've had this experience here. You build a highway, 5 lanes each side, but not many cars are going on it. That's what's happening now with your digital payment system. And the American road, which is very old, full of potholes, 2 lanes, not 5, it's full of traffic because all the capitalist profits and trade is being financed through transactions on that old highway. But already there's a migration from the American highway to the Chinese superhighway. It started with Russians. That's what the Ukraine war did. And then, if you're a Saudi Arabian, okay, you're a Saudi Arabian, an oligarch. You do most of your business with the United States. You love your dollars. But you're thinking, these people, the Americans, confiscated 400 billion of the Russians' money because they didn't like the Russians. For whatever reason. Maybe the Russians deserved it. Doesn't matter, I'm not making an ethical point here. Okay? You think you're Saudi Arabian. I'm not a very good person myself. Maybe they will not like me tomorrow. Maybe I will do something to annoy them tomorrow. Maybe they will take part of my dough, right? So why don't I diversify? Some of that money I will transact through the superhighway that the Chinese have built. Why do you think Saudi Arabia is interested in joining the BRICS? That's the reason. There's no other reason. That is the reason. Now, go back to Washington. You're looking at that and you think, this superhighway that these Chinese have built is a clear and present danger to my hegemony. That's why they have the CHIPS Act, because they want to reduce your capacity to invest in this superhighway and make it attractive for everybody else. This is why they are creating circumstances of choking anyone outside the United States who wants to trade with China, because they don't want this superhighway. So it's not that China is getting bigger. It is not that China is spying. It is not Taiwan. It is that China has built a digital cloud capital-based superhighway for payments, which is a clear and present danger to the monopoly of the dollar payment system, which is the only reason why the United States is hegemonic. So the question is, what do we do about that? Allow me just to say 4 things very quickly, and then I stop this, and then we can take this up further. The first thing you need to do is you must reduce your dependency on the American trade deficit. But allow me as a macroeconomist to say that you can only do this is if you increase the wage share in this country. The amount of money which is essentially ending up in the pockets of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie and the middle class in this country. Because macroeconomically speaking, it is impossible under the current 5-year plan to have the degree of investment in manufacturing that is necessary in order to meet the growth rates of the 5-year plan without depending on the American trade deficit. The only way of maintaining this investment and maintaining the growth rate without dependency on the American trade deficit is by boosting aggregate demand domestically. And there are simple ways of doing that, and your digital payment system is a way of doing it. I can discuss this later if you want. That's the number 1 thing you need to do. Reduce your dependency on the American trade deficit. Secondly, you need to appeal through soft power, through engagement with the local communities in the global south. Building a factory or some infrastructure or some energy hub in Ethiopia or in Namibia or wherever, it contributes to the development of the local country. But you've got to engage with the local community. You have to remember your marks, that there is class conflict happening in Namibia, in the Congo, in Ethiopia, and the local ruling class is destroying the prospects of the local working class. And the Chinese, I know you don't want to interfere in a party political level, but you have to, the people of Namibia must understand that China and Chinese business and the Chinese presence are their allies, not the allies of their oligarchy. That's how you win hearts and minds in Africa. You need to do the same in Europe. Because in Europe there is a concerted effort to turn the people of Europe against the Chinese, along the lines of pure racism, xenophobia, Orientalism, and so on. The same people who are turning the Italians, the Greeks, the French, the Germans against the Chinese are the people who are essentially working towards the diminution of the life prospects of the Germans, the French, the Italians, and the Greeks. So when, for instance, Costco entered the port of Piraeus, I know that they ran the port better than the Greeks did. I know that there is less corruption, and I know that the conditions of the workers in the port are better now. But Costco made a mistake by not engaging in community relations. That's the third thing, okay? And the fourth thing, soft power within the United States. We must think together, and I say we. I'm not Chinese, but I have an interest in ending the Cold War. Because it is in the interest of humanity to avoid, firstly, nuclear confrontation, and secondly, to find a way of communicating and collaborating to end the very fast march of humanity towards a climate catastrophe. Without cooperation, it can't happen. We cannot succeed in saving our planet. So this is why I'm saying we. It is important to approach American progressives. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. The Democratic Socialists of America, who have become rather influential in the United States. Many of them are my friends. People like Bernie Sanders. They have been sucked into the anti-Chinese mindset by the establishment. It is important to bring them back because they don't understand that trade wars are class wars. If you put it to them that way, if we put it to them that way, there's a chance that they will understand it. That the moment you have a trade war being imposed on China, the American working class is going to suffer. Some jobs may be saved through tariffs if they recreate some manufacturing job, but that won't work. That is not going to work. It is not a situation where you stop a few BYD cars from coming to the United States and suddenly there will be more manufacturing jobs in Ohio. That is idiocy. But we need to convince the progressives in the United States that their interests are in de-escalating the new Cold War between the United States and China. Thank you.
妈妈是我的心肝宝贝，她值得最好的。想帮助睡眠，促进排便，我为妈妈选太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌。知道妈妈总舍不得买给自己，我来买。希望妈妈睡得香，假巴黎。现在就上快点购母亲节太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌宠爱妈咪超值专区，享各项健康好礼最高3重送，满5000加送520元购物金。透过中天新闻网 App 下单或输入 CTI 推荐码，每单再减50元哦。